So I like to start these conversations by asking, what does home taste like for you? Give us a feel of who you both are.
Home, well, salad and chocolate chip cookies.
Together?
Sometimes, sometimes. I grew up with a vegetarian mother,
Got you.
but with one who has an incredibly intense sweet tooth. A lot of the desserts that are in here are familiar in the way that I grew up. But over time, I've become really obsessed with all manner of salads. And I don't just mean lettucey things, but like grilled vegetables. But home tastes like vegetarian food, foods from the garden, things that are plant-based.
Great, thank you. How about you, Morgan?
Mine is probably chicken pot pie. I feel like if I had a last meal, it would be my mom's chicken pot pie and ice cream. And I think my friends and colleagues know this about me, but I have every single night like a micro ice cream sundae of like a hot chocolate chip cookie with ice cream on top. Wow. And so it brings a lot of joy to my life. And so that feels like home.
Joy. Joy, I love that, I love that. So now we have an idea of what home is like for you. Give us some context for how you got to this space and this book in particular.
As we say in the intro, we were working together and had two independent experiences with our passions for uplifting women. We both saw them as marginalized in the story of American cooking. But the more we talked during meetings and in the test kitchen, we realized that there was a small shared space that we had that we could really do more to tell their stories using recipes. And by coincidence, the book department at ATK was interested in a book. And we do a lot of surveying of our readers. And so we understood that a Southern book was going to be one of interest. And so we put those all together and came up with this book.
Yeah, and Morgan, you're Southern as well. So
Yeah,
it's your work, but it's also your heritage.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sure this is probably something we'll talk more about, like what it even means to be Southern is sort of a complex
It's in here.
thing. Yes, yeah, exactly, good. But yeah, so I spent a lot of my formative years in North Carolina, and so that food culture really impacted me a lot. And so I moved actually away from North Carolina for the job at America's Test Kitchen in 2014. And then I've been there ever since. So yeah, so I feel like the South is, and my family's all still in the South. They're in North Carolina and South Carolina, and so it feels very near and dear to me.
Thank you. I'm gonna pick up on that because one of the quotes I pulled here is the South is a place, but it's also a feeling. And so I'm gonna go towards geography. Where is the South? I've heard deep South, dirty South. Like where is the South per se in the context of this book in particular?
Well, Morgan and the team used a number of variables in order to make that distinction.
Yeah.
We often hear from people that the South is a state of mind. But we needed to be more concrete since neither one of us was living in the South. I'm from Southern California, so we knew there'd be heat about that. Like what does she know about the South?
She's not even from the South.
She's not even from the South, right? So we took
But you were president of Southern Foodways Alliance.
I was president of Southern Foodways Alliance, but again, that was, I think, intentional, putting the Yankee Westerner, in charge, because she wouldn't really know what they were arguing about. So we did choose some geographic demarcations, and one of those was the Mason-Dixon line for the North. And then something that's interesting that most people don't know is the Western barrier for the South border. Most people think of Houston as the end of the American South in Texas.
Right.
But a scholar at the University of Texas did some research and wrote a book that explained that the topography of the state of Texas actually changes at the center of the state in Austin. And in Austin, it becomes the Texas Hill Country. So it's rocky and it's hilly, and you lose that piney woods thing that's happening in East Texas. So Austin is the actual physical end of the South. So it made it easier when Morgan was coming up with recipes that were Texas and Floridian, to be able to say, oh, no, there's a physical difference.
So vegetation dictates, I guess, the kind of produce available and might influence the food as well.
Right.
Got you.
Yeah, and it varies a lot. Like even the South, I think, is such a diverse landscape too that you see a lot of that. So So I do think, yeah, it, like, I think the borders, like, it's hard to say that it's all just based on exactly like what grows where. Like, it's like about all sorts of things. And I think even like, I mean, maybe this is because I'm from North Carolina. I'm like, North Carolina is very different than Texas, is very different than Florida, is very different than Alabama, but they all blur.
Yeah. Can you say some ways in which you've observed the difference in terms of cuisine in particular, or that feeling you make reference to?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, maybe I'll say a few things here. So like, one is that I think in North Carolina, I am very I grew up in very liberal parts of North Carolina, and you see that definitely a lot in different states and how it spreads out and how it is distributed in different states too. So I feel like my experience of North Carolina is also a little different than a lot of people's. But I think I also lived in Alabama for a year, and I had a very different, people, when they would talk about politics, had very different ways of approaching it based on my two experiences there. I also think the food culture, Alabama's further south, so you have different things that grow well there. And then I also, of course, think about barbecue. I do a lot of barbecue and grilling. So North Carolina barbecue is whole hog and these really vinegary-based barbecue sauces. And then in Alabama, you get into the smoked chicken and the white barbecue sauce. And then Texas, you get into the brisket. And then in Memphis, you get into the ribs. So I also think all people have their different specialties too.
Great. So we've set the context, right? So we know where the South is, generally speaking. We know how you both are. Tell us the story of how this book, from my, at least, observation, I see you, Morgan, primarily in the science-based recipe testing very heavily, and Toni, your work as a journalist. How did this story come together to really produce this book, and what were you trying to tell in terms of story?
Well, when I went to work for America's Test Kitchen, my priority was to bring more of the storytelling to our already important, rigorous recipe development reputation. And so, as all of you that follow America's Test Kitchen know, we are known for the science-based nature of our recipes and ensuring that whatever recipe we provide is accessible to anyone. And what that can mean is that you dilute the origin story in your effort to make sure that somebody in any part of the country can recreate that dish. And keeping in mind that before I came on, right at the time that we were suffering during the pandemic. And so it made sense to be able to start to tell people that they could make the foods of other communities, because we all became accustomed to ordering ingredients online. Right, so in the past, you couldn't really tell people to make a recipe as authentically as possible, because obviously you might not be able to get those ingredients at your local grocery store. But once we all became more conditioned to buying recipes online, then it was so much easier for us to go back to that philosophy that I learned in journalism school and that I've spent most of my life dedicated to, which is to making sure that the people behind the stories, behind the recipes, are as important as the science. And before Morgan talks more about recipe development, I will just say that in line with that, we have this habit of thinking that home cooks aren't cooking in a scientific manner. And so that's also been an important part of my work, to ensure that we see the competency and the proficiency in someone who's just making gravy because they don't say they're making a bechamel sauce or working with a French technique like a roux. They are making a scientific dish. And Morgan,
and they probably made 10,000 hours of gravy making over their lifetime, right? So they become experts. So
yeah, one thing I've listened to Toni talk about is how home cooks, they can it's not that they're not measuring a tablespoon of salt, it's that they can feel it and weigh it that way. They can feel it in that. So I think your assertion is really accurate, that Toni was mostly leading a lot of the storytelling piece of this, and then I was leading a lot of the recipes. But that's also my team, a lot of my team is here, so that's exciting, from Cook's Country and America's Test Kitchen. But yeah, so a lot of these are just recipes that we've had in our archives, and we either slightly updated or adjusted slightly. But we have a very specific formula we follow, and it's kind of intense. But yeah, so we'll make, if we're gonna do something like pat in the pan biscuits, we'll make 5 versions of that, and I'll try them together as a team, and then we'll do little tweaks to them along the way. So we may test like butter versus lard, and then we might go back and test cold butter versus melted butter versus like room temp butter. And we'll try them all until we get to a recipe that we feel like is really good and really reproducible. And then we build our recipe from that. So yeah, so I feel like that was what I was like really focused on that when we started this. And then I think as I worked with Toni, we started to really lean into the stories a lot more.
Great, thank you both. So you've ended with 300 recipes. That includes, it's a big number, right? But 300 recipes that have been tested scientifically, but also have the story nuances and the origin of them. So thank you for doing that. We have an audience question that will bring us into the next section. Are there widespread hallmarks of Southern food, or is it regional within the South?
I feel like there are some widespread ones. I mean, I guess you think of cornbread and biscuits. I mean, like kind of the stereotypes are fried chicken, cornbread, biscuits. And I feel like you can get like, I mean, maybe like the kind of things you get at a Southern food restaurant. Like if you go to like buttermilk and bourbon here, like maybe those are the things that I feel like are like sort of stereotypical to Southern food. But also I do think a lot of Southern places have that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think they're pretty consistent across the board. You can have as Morgan said, you might have cornbread that is got other things added into it in Texas. So you might get jalapenos and chilies and things like cheese, right? But if you're in deep Alabama, they don't want sugar. Like it's just the cornmeal and the basic leavener and the milk and stuff like that. But there's no additives happening.
Yeah.
Right. So even though the community of the South shares this general recipe and this concept of a recipe, there are variables that occur across regions, and it makes sense, right? It's based on accessibility again, and even though we think of the South as a warm place, there is still some produce that grows better in one region than another.
In their coastal cities, for example,
Right, for
that might
example,
influence
yeah.
that. So along that line, you mentioned stereotypes, and I think I like to out myself as someone who's learning to become American. I think I'm a bit exposed initially to stereotypical Southern food. Say ways in which you've exposed more a diverse array of Southern recipes, and not just biscuits. I think there are like tons in here, but there are other recipes I haven't heard of. There are other rice dishes, for example, that you're accustomed to one, but another one. Can you speak some more to how you went about pulling or gathering diverse recipes to combat a stereotype?
Yeah. So I can sort of talk through in a loose way how we got to like our lineup of, you said 300 recipes. We like had way more at first. So we started by, like, it is actually like condensed, and this huge book is condensed.
Volume 1.
Yeah. So we started by combing through our archives at America's Test Kitchen of Southern Recipes, and we landed somewhere at like 600 recipes. And then we got to work with a historical consultant, Casey Highsmith, who's in Chapel Hill, and she did her PhD in anthropologic studies, like focusing on women in food. And so she helped add. So then we got to like 650. And then from there we realized we had to eliminate. So we started we had a huge spreadsheet, and we were looking at them based on like where in the South they were from. We also looked at them based on like this cultural element. Like we had a few demographics that we knew we wanted to represent. So like, of course, Tex-Mex has a lot of influence in Texas. So we knew we wanted to highlight that. There's there's like a Filipino population in Asheville. There's the Viet Cajun population that was in Houston or in New Orleans and moved to Houston. And so we wanted to like highlight all of these. So we were looking at the spreadsheet, seeing like where we can eliminate. Are we like covering everyone we want to cover? And like, yeah, we were trying to see like where can we cut from this, and also what else do we need to add? And then we went through again and combed for like woman-ish stories and stories that would have a woman angle that we could tell to like also make sure we covered that. But yeah, like I think like the rest of our country, like the South has continued to evolve. I think it was already way more diverse than a lot of people think, and then it's continued to evolve. And so like we have gobi Manchurian, which is a dish from an Indian restaurant in Asheville, and like we talk about that in this book. Like we have, I'm trying to think, like we have these like guava oat cookies that are from a Cuban restaurant in Washington, D.C. But like these things exist in the South, and just because they're not like falling into that stereotype, like people are making them, and like who gets to say who is Southern and who counts as Southern. So like we definitely like thought a lot about that while we were building this.
Yeah, thank you. You went actually into the global influence I've noticed in this recipe book. You spoke definitely to various populations, Vietnamese, Polish, there's Caribbean, and there's also Tex-Mex. Were there any recipes in particular that surprised you? Or alerted you, for example, where you just pay attention to? The guava one, for example, sounds like one it's in DC,
I think the guava cookies was a surprise for us, but generally speaking, we were already aware throughout history that immigrants had played such an important role in the fusing of their native ways with the local foods that they encountered when they moved here. And in this day and age, it's easy for us to forget that we're a nation of immigrants. But everyone has come from somewhere else and brought with them their particular ways. And so then when those ways blend together, whether it's with the indigenous foods or with other populations, you start to see these changes and the creation of foods that then disappear into a canon that we just think of as the universal Southern thing. And unfortunately, historically, we have considered that as white and black. And rich and poor. It's been based on class, it's been based on race. And so what was interesting for us was to use this term that I made up, womanish, right? Just womanish, and ask Morgan and the team to go through and look for those recipes that had been influenced just by a woman. So once we thought through culture and region and type, and like we went through all of those boxes, then we had to ask ourselves, now where did women play a role? And that was, the final most important variable.
Great. We have another audience question. How did you find and connect with a woman who contributed to the recipes? What was it like in building rapport and also having them share their stories? 70 women, I think, were pulled in as writers. There are some who were Q&As, or others who did recipes. How did you gather?
Yeah, 70 contributors, and there are so many more because we try to ensure that every head note, every sidebar connected to a woman in some way. As I say in the introduction, I've been around the food industry a little while, and I was president of the Southern Foodways Alliance, which was founded 20 years ago at Ole Miss University. And during that time, I had lots of sidebar conversations with women who were very frustrated. And so we would huddle at the end of a conference. We might huddle in the ladies' room. We might whisper, during a conference, if someone was speaking, they would, that's not the way it is, right? But I just kept hearing all of these conversations, and there really wasn't anything that could be done about it at that time. And it wasn't until Morgan started talking about her own passion for women that we realized that I could go back to those women and invite them to tell some of those stories that we had heard, that I had heard. So what we have here is an interesting mix of journalism, which can just be the straight up story of the difference between White Lily and Martha White Flour. We have some scholarly pieces that help you understand the history of baking powder in America. But then we also have some very personal stories, and those are the ones that were rooted in those conversations, right? So we have, I have a kind of a peculiar way of thinking. And so I had heard a lot of male misogyny in music lyrics as they relate to the Waffle House. And so we spoke with a lyricist in Tennessee who wrote an amazing piece for us about the nurturing space of the Waffle House instead of it being a place that's a pickup place for guys to go and get down and out, down and out women who are, vulnerable. She spun a whole different version of that story.
So retelling that story.
So there are women. We have Virginia Willis, who appeared at the Test Kitchen some years ago, and she's lost a tremendous amount of weight. And so she talked about this frustration with the perception that the white woman in the South was always supposed to be frail and need protection, and especially as she was juxtaposed against the black woman servant character. and yet they're all supposed to be making delicious biscuits.
Right.
Right, like how do those
Right.
two things go together, that
Right.
you are supposed to be thin and never taste the biscuit
Right.
dough?
So going back to stereotypes again.
Stereotypes
right? Yeah.
again. So there was a lot of that. And then once I made that initial call to see if people were willing to go deep and how deep, then I turned them over to Morgan, and Morgan was able to extract even more from them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's it. I feel like you said the introduction, and then we'd work with these women, and they'd often we'd come up with what they wanted to write and what would fit, and we'd do a little more puzzling on our spreadsheet to make sure that it fit in certain places. But yeah, also there was just so much like building on. There were those 70 women writers who had, I think, so much more to this book than it would be otherwise. But we also got to do a lot of research, and we did a handful of interviews just of like the other women who we didn't actually have write for us, especially like people who didn't have the time or bandwidth, or maybe were chefs and didn't want to write specifically. Like, so we got to do a handful of interviews with people, and a lot of them I think were really excited about the idea of getting highlighted, and also excited to talk about like their like what Southern food means to them. So yeah, so it was very positive, I would say.
Yeah.
One of the fun ones was when Morgan, during the research on Louisiana, came back with a quote about Ella Brennan, who is the matriarch behind Brennan's and Commander's Palace. And there was a whole story about how she leads that empire. But one of the last sentences in this piece that Morgan wrote was about what was the nickname that
Hurricane.
they called her?
Ella.
Hurricane Ella. And
Yeah.
I was just so mad about that. You know, it was just like, this is a prominent woman who is well known, who has achieved so much. Why is that going to be the way we remember her,
Right.
as a hurricane?
Or a force to reckon with?
Maybe so, but I was just like not happy about it. So we reached out to her daughter, T,
Yeah.
and asked T to reflect on her recollections of her mother and what that moniker meant to her,
Right.
watching her mother excel the way that she did. It's a really great story.
And that's the Banana Foster restaurant, I call
I
it.
think it's with,
with
there's a
eggs,
couple. There's
that-
Eggs Hussard and Bananas Foster, both from Brennan.
Beautiful story.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So we have another audience question about going back to the feel. So you mentioned the feel of measurement, for example. And how do you determine how to make a recipe for a page when it's usually based on oral tradition? So I think leaning into the conversation around oral tradition, lack of accuracy, that's myth of not measuring, and how things are passed on. Stand with me in the kitchen, watch me.
Yeah.
My mom would say, don't touch, just watch, until you earn the right to touch things. But talk some more about that feel.
Well, one of the essays that we have included is by Sean Chavis, who worked for Time Inc. and was a food editor there. And she writes about the difference between Southern and Soul, which is a question that gets asked a lot. And if you think about it, cooking with one soul implies a spirited nature. It means that you're more improvisational.
Right.
But again, back to this ATK versus home cook, science versus feel.
Right.
What people neglect to realize is that person is working with a muscle memory. We're talking about people that cooked generations ago,
Right.
who cooked with more regularity than we do today. So it's just so easy to forget because we have access to a dozen large eggs at the grocery store, that people's determination of how many eggs went into a dish was based on whatever the hens did that day. Right? So you didn't know if you had 4 or 5 because you didn't know until you went out to get them from the hen house. And the same is true for measuring. Those women, I had a woman in, I forgot now where, but she actually told me that she understood based on with a line on her fingers, the amount, or as Morgan alluded to earlier, the weight of the salt in their hands. So what I've always encouraged people to do is, if you're trying to capture those recipes from those people, you do go with them and cook with them and watch. Because if you ask them, they're going to lie. If you ask them what's their recipe, they're going to leave out an ingredient because it's an expression of their determination to, remain immortal.
Right.
So they're not going to tell you they sprinkled it in a little sugar in the
Correct.
cabbage. But if you go there with them, you get a chance to watch them. And even if you stop them in the middle of it, you know, and just before she's about to drop the salt, then you can measure it if you just have to know. But she knows by the weight.
By the way, yeah.
Or the pinch in her fingers. And even chefs do that. Like you can tell,
Over
see
time.
chefs on cooking shows or even on our show, you know, pick up and say, it's a tablespoon as they sprinkle. So,
Yeah.
but Morgan's role in recipe development helps us quantify.
Yeah. And some of these practices go across cultures. I know in my household, the rice measure, somehow you know the part of your finger that the water should reach. Maybe other folks know the rice measure, right? So again, it's somewhat scientific, right? But not exactly a actual tangible measuring.
Yeah, and I also think something sort of beautiful happens over the generations too, like as recipes evolve. So like in a dream world, yeah, you're going to your grandma and watching her do it and you're measuring and you're keeping that. But like we have a few family dishes that like my grandma made and then my mom made and now I make. And I feel like you also even adding that little spin adds some intrigue to them too. So I don't know that it's like it needs to be that perfect every time.
Every time, right? I love the audience questions. One more here related to ingredients. So how much, if any, did growing your own ingredients during most of this work, at least the origin stories, and eating seasonally come up in these processes or uncovering these stories?
I think the food of the South is known as the original farm to table cooking, right? So there isn't. I don't think we both looked at each other like, oh, do you know? I don't know that there's an overt conversation about vegetables or garden cooking that came up in our storytelling.
I mean, well, so I think to a little bit because you think about like we do have a person who wrote about the different farmers throughout the South, and I think that impacts them. So like the beginning of our vegetable chapter is all about the different farmers in the South, and I also do think like we run into this with every sort of recipe development is like getting seasonal produce. So like if we want to do something with okra. Or actually one of my favorites in here is scuppernongs, which is like a type of grape that's grown in the South. And you can now get them up here at certain times of year, but it's so seasonal. It's like end of August, early September that you can get scuppernongs. So like we're planning that out as we're developing this table of contents, and like we're planning to develop it during that time or freeze enough that we can. So I do think you have to think about it while you're developing. I think because, what Toni was alluding to earlier, it's so much easier to order stuff.
Right.
Even produce is so much easier to ship. So I do think it has sort of evolved a little bit. But I think the South definitely has its own horticulture and yeah.
I'm gonna come back to the farming and subsistence, but I wanna also ask this question. So Southern cooking has a reputation for not being healthy. Is that true? And are there ways to make it healthier, or would you invalidate if it's not, saying it's truly Southern then? Is it really unhealthy, or is it a misconception?
I think it's untrue. Okay, I'm biased, I'm from the South. I think it's a mix. I think you do get more of the you get more inclination to butter and fried things often, but there's also because to Toni's point of farm to table, there's so much good produce. I've never had better access to produce than when I lived in Alabama, and then secondary was North Carolina. And so a lot of people are doing these really fresh salads, and they're doing really interesting things, and they're doing these things that are a little lighter, and they're letting the vegetables shine. So a tomato sandwich in the South is tomatoes, salt, pepper, mayonnaise and white bread. And maybe that's not our ideal of healthy, but you're really highlighting the produce. I do think you probably, run into slightly heavier things, but also there are ways to adapt that. There are a lot of cookbooks about that sort of thing. And I also do think, in our culture, just cooking at home to me is such an expression of health. I think by bringing it into your house and cooking it, you have a different level of control over it.
Right.
And you also to me, that feels so much better than eating in something packaged. I don't know. You came up from California, so you might have a different.
Well, I'm thinking about how Southern food migrated out of the South, not just with the African Americans during the Great Migration, but just generally speaking, how Southern food goes from being something that's a home-cooked meal to restaurant food.
Right.
And anytime you convert food to a broader appeal, you're going to make all kinds of adjustments to it. And so the dish that I like to use to illustrate that is fried chicken. There's a corner in Atlanta that has 4 fried chicken outlets, one on every corner. All the competitors, they must realize that this is the population and this is where we need to dominate and sell fried chicken. Right. Well, fried chicken was not something you ate regularly in the South because you needed those birds for other purposes. So eating chicken on a Sunday was a very special occasion. That's why we get these stories about feeding the preacher the best part of the bird, because it wasn't something you ate all the time.
Thanks.
When they did fry it, they were not using a deep fat fryer. They were using a skillet with a half full, smaller amount of oil in it. So there again is some discussion about technique. They were pan frying, not deep frying.
Which is a commercial.
That's a commercial intervention that happens because you need to produce a lot of it quickly. And then lastly, the health complication for frying chicken in a public setting, and this is getting into my nutrition background, but you heat and cool the oil all day, and you're creating carcinogens in that oil because it's not intended to be heated to that extreme and then settle down and then reheat it again the next day, and so you're creating all of these problems, not to even mention the growing birds in this industrialized food complex. But they were also having birds that were rooting around in the hen house, right? They were free range, we call them, meaning they had free range. They were exercised, right? So there's a lot of perceptions about Southern and thus soul food that are rooted more in what happened to that food when it left the home than what is really inherent in the food.
Yeah, thanks for sharing context, because as you're speaking, I'm hearing the context, meaning fried chicken, for example, as perceived now is a commercial product versus a occasional, special, pan-fried, free-range, amazing bird, right? I'm rebranding.
That's exactly right.
Thank you, but the context is important. So once it left the Southern home or the subsistence, it has moved on to be a commercial product that, as we know it today. So.
The other example of that we talk about in the book, and others have heard me talk about a lot, is cornmeal and cornbread. And my friend Ronnie Lundy, who is a well-known and awarded Appalachian food writer, and I met over an argument about whether sugar belonged in cornbread. And when I said that the other night, wherever we were, the woman in the front row just kept glaring at me the whole rest of the night, like, no, it does not belong in there. And what happened is when Southerners left the South and went looking for cornmeal in the North, it wasn't as sweet. It wasn't the locally grown corn that was dried and ground there. It was commercially available. It was a lot of dust in the bag. And so, of course, they started adding sugar to it until one of the scholarly pieces that we have attached to our cornbread story and the sugar in the cornbread anecdote is about Jiffy corn mix.
Yeah, well, so then Jiffy, I feel like they sort of shifted things. So, my favorite part of the Jiffy story is that their slogan, they were marketed, and their slogan was, "It's so easy, a man can do it." So they played off that. But it was in the 1950s, and they were trying to make this box mix that people could stir together. But they did really lean into the sugar. So it's so cakey, it's so sweet. And then that just became something people started associating with cornmeal. It wasn't just like the natural sugars you're getting from the corn. It's actually like, oh, now cornbread is this level of sweet. So I feel like then it's kind of created this further sort of like version of what they are.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a theme here. As things are commercialized, as food is commercialized, it's removed from its original context and its original flavors. Thank you. Speaking of controversies. The audience question is, what is considered the most authentic? And I'm going to underline authentic here so we can go back to authentic as a word itself. Southern barbecue, dry rub or wet barbecue sauce? Morgan.
Well, before she answers, let's level set about authentic.
Okay. Oh, you want to go back there? Yes.
Yeah, let's just get that out of the way, and then she can wax for 2 hours about barbecue. We're past the ability to define something as authentic anymore, and I think the internet was the great democratizer and created that, and we certainly struggle with that at ATK, and how we can then say this is the dish of that community, right? If everybody has an interpretation of it, we've already talked about all of those variables that change a dish,
Right.
then what is the way to make it? And I think what we're learning in that is you make it as close to, as close to the representation as is possible. But ultimately, we're all talking about adapting it. And so if your family doesn't eat onions, don't put onions in it. Like, it can still be delicious and a close approximation to the thing without us getting hung up on whether it's the official way to do it, because now there's no more official.
Right.
They're just, people have now got their own ways of doing things, even barbecuers.
Yeah. Well, so I think it actually varies so much based on where the barbecue is. So like, I think typically in North Carolina, people are using a dry rub, but that doesn't mean that people aren't using wet rubs. And in Texas, people are typically, like, they have a Dalmatian rub that's just salt and pepper. So it's like, that's what they call it, is Dalmatian rub, because it's salt, pepper. So it looks like
Dalmatian.
Yeah. So so I think but then in Memphis, there's so many people who are using wet rubs, and so I think it varies a lot place to place. And I think, to Toni's point, calling anything authentic is a really tough thing to do in the food world anymore.
Yeah. And there's a great map in here, a barbecue map by Raz. It really speaks to different styles. So.
Yeah. I get very geeked about that stuff. So
I can tell you're excited. I can tell. I want to shift a little bit back to the idea of that farm to table, right, and subsistence growth or cooking. And I recognize there are a few recipes here that really spoke to cooking as almost an upward mobility or economic vehicle. Folks who were selling the chili queens, for example, in San Antonio. When you buy the book, you'll be able to dive into that, the stories. Those who were peddling fried chicken, for example, in cars, talk some more about how food became a vehicle for mainly women in particular to make money. And not just cottage industry, but many went on to be well-resourced from food.
Yeah, so I mean, I can start here, and then I think, Toni, you could add a lot more to this, but it's one of those things that we did keep seeing as a theme as we were diving into these stories of time and time again, women using food as a way to gain economic independence, and also just create their own world. So to your point, the fried chicken, we have a introduction for our fried chapter that talks about these women who would sell fried chicken to trains going through Gordonsville, Virginia. And they would, this was, what timeline was that? Do you have an idea?
I think it was the early 1900s.
Yeah, so they would do that. It was traditionally Black women doing it. And so they would sell it, and that's how they started making their own money and making their own financial freedom. But you see that in the Kala story, so it's selling these race fritters. You see that in there's a story of bourbon balls and these women who got through the Depression by selling bourbon balls. There's a really fun story about this bootlegger from Kentucky who is a woman, Maggie Bailey, and her nickname was Queen Maggie. And she bootlegged in a dry county in Kentucky, and then she sold moonshine and rather than use it just to get totally rich, she just took care of her community. So she sent kids to school with it, and she just took care of her community with this bootlegging money. So you picture this she was selling moonshine, I think, until she was in her 90s. So you picture this older woman doing that, and you're that's so cool.
And still nurturing from the resources.
And still nurturing, it feels very nice to see that. So, yeah.
And it's so funny that you picked all of the historic women, which is the converse of what we usually do. So the modern women are also where there were so many stories that we could tell. And so there's a great story about a woman who's a shrimper. So if you think about Forrest Gump and his shrimping boat, we have a story about a woman who's doing that. We have...
I'm thinking about Preeti from... in Chapel Hill. Preeti Waz is one of our contributors, and she has her restaurant in Durham. She has this amazing restaurant that has Indian and Southern food that we actually just got to go to.
And she's adamant that Indian food, back to your question, is she had somebody come in and tell her that her business was going to fail because the food she was serving was not Indian at all. She said, I'm the Indian woman
And
here.
that makes my food Indian.
I'm telling you, this is the food we have at home, but it's not.
Tikka masala.
And
She didn't have
said
tikka
this woman
masala
said
on her
tiki.
menu.
This is not tiki masala. And so, so there is that, right?
Yeah.
Where again, back to this is
Commercialized.
all threaded together. There's
Yeah.
the commercialization, there's the stereotypes, there's the pigeonholing, and all of that to say that ultimately what Morgan was after through her project and her passion for doing this was a way to uplift the women that she was working with at the Women's Center. And that was the spirit of our conversations. When I meet with, the staff, we talk about more than just work.
Right.
And what did you do this weekend? How, what are you working on? And she would talk about these women that she wanted to help empower in some way. And so I sent her to to the Bay Area, to La Cocina, which is an organization set up to help immigrant women use the food of their culture to develop their freedom.
Right.
And they're not to dilute the dishes. They make them,
As
the
is.
pupusas, the way that they're supposed to be made. And so when she came back, it just inflamed this story, this idea even more. Like she wanted to figure out how to use recipes and storytelling, and lo and behold, in the end of it all, many of the stories that we encountered were absolutely about women using food as a tool for their own uplift.
Yeah.
And I think, full circle, that is what more women need to hear today,
Yeah.
is that they can be independent and provide for their own self-care using food.
Yeah. Thank you. We're about to shift pretty. Oh. Thank you. We're about to shift pretty soon to a demo, but we have another audience question that speaks again to change. So did you discover that Southern food has changed a lot? Are there some important old recipes that are really now gone or have just fallen out of use?
I feel like we should talk about the Aunt Jules pie.
We have to talk about the Aunt Jules
Talk about
pie.
Aunt Jules
Scott
pies.
is here. So one of the recipes, we have two that are our favorites, and the other of us always tells this story. But on the back of the book, there's a spectacularly beautiful cake, and I'll let Morgan, I don't know, maybe I'll talk about it both. But there's a recipe that was in our archive, and one of our editors came to us and said, we got a problem with this recipe. Someone has pointed out that it has a racist connotation. And the title of the recipe was for Jefferson Davis pie. And this is a very old school pie. America's Test Kitchen is not guilty, the only, outlet that ever referred to this dish.
Right.
But it's basically like a chess pie or a pecan pie, that gooey, sweet, but the basis of it is raisins instead of pecans. And apparently there was a housewife who hosted a party in Missouri, and when she was asked by the social pages about her recipe, she said, oh, it's the Jefferson Davis pie. And some journalists in recent years have done more research and discovered that she also said in that article, her cook, Aunt Jewel something, made the pie. And so when Scott came to us and the question was, well, what do we want to do?
Right.
That was another impetus for this book.
To
was
rectify.
To rectify that. Like, is this America's Test Kitchen's place to give this woman back her authority over her dish? And again, we all just sat on it for a while, and I don't even know whether we were certain about including it, because it's a very strong story to tell. But ultimately, when Casey Highsmith came on board as our consultant, she knew a young woman who was a activist baker in Virginia, and so she remade the pie and modernized it, and everybody loved it. And the same is true. You can read the story on the for the cake that's on the back. There was an enslaved
It's a
woman
beautiful
whose
cake.
recipe we remade.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. We're going to transition now to a demonstration with Morgan. Toni, I want to thank you for your thoughtfulness, your work, not just this work, but the amazing work you've done. And folks who haven't dived into the book just yet, I mean, the chapters are just beautiful with notes and questions and storytelling, but also backed by science. So it's a great blend of art and science, I think.
Thank you.
So, Toni, thank you. As a reminder, both Toni and Morgan will be signing. I lost my microphone. We'll be signing copies outside after the demo or after this conversation. So.
Yeah, well,
What are
we
we
just
making?
felt like we needed to cook with y'all. So we have some fresh corn muffins up here, and this is just sort of one of the like recipes in the book that got us kicked off on this too. So this is a recipe I developed during the pandemic, but we got really excited about doing a corn muffin, and at the time I was cooking my way through Asha Gomez's book. So Asha Gomez is a Southern Indian chef who she has a book called My Two Souths. So she talks about her background in Southern India and then the Southern US.
Oh, beautiful.
And so, yeah, so she talks a lot about that. And so I was cooking my way through her cookbook kind of get through the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I started making her cardamom cornbread. And so we decided to do a cardamom. I was working on this cornbread or corn muffin at the same time. And so we decided to do a cardamom butter with it.
Ooh.
So, okay, so it's very simple, but I wanted to show it just because I feel like there's some good teaching points, even if you guys don't want to make this specific recipe. But
Yeah. And I see sugar already.
there's sugar in here.
Yeah.
This is a sweet muffin. I know that was a point of contention in this recipe, but there is sugar in here.
Okay.
So I have some cornmeal, flour, baking powder, baking soda, and sugar in here.
Okay.
And then I pulled out some of the cornmeal. So this is a half cup of cornmeal, and you mix that in with milk. So I have a cup of milk. And I don't have a microwave out here, but you would microwave this.
Right.
And that really thickens it up. So like this one I did before, it's actually like now too thick.
Like porridge.
Yeah, but it does get it gets it like porridgey. So it gets it this really nice thick texture. You just microwave it for about 3 minutes. And the cornmeal actually absorbs some of the milk. And so that just means you get a really nice corn muffin at the end. So you can make it so that you get both a higher ratio of cornmeal, so you get more corn flavor. And then it also just keeps you having a really nice, moist muffin at the end.
I have a question.
Yes,
I may have
go ahead.
practiced at home to pretend like I'm on ATK.
Great.
Does the milk matter? Or does it plant-based, dairy milk? Does it matter?
It does. I mean, we developed this with whole milk just because
Okay.
I think that's the most universal. I've done a little testing with like almond milk, and I think it honestly would work fine, but this has sour cream in there too, so I don't know if
so
you're gonna
dairy's
like,
already
yeah,
there.
it's like
Yeah.
exactly, like dairy's already happening. So then,
Commit fully to it.
but yeah, I vote commit fully. But I think, and then we always tend to do whole milk just because it keeps things nice and moist, and when you're doing a corn muffin, it's like you might as well, you want a little bit of the richness in there.
Okay. So you have melted butter with that cornmeal mush.
Yep, exactly, with the cornmeal mush. And then I'm adding some sour cream and some eggs.
Okay.
And just gonna mix these up.
Commercial-sized eggs.
Commercial-sized eggs, exactly.
Yeah.
I know. There was, I know, some of my coworkers were saying how they went and saw Rose Levy Birnbaum talk, and she's like, that's one of her things about why she always weighs the eggs, because they used to change so much. So she's like, this is my way of being consistent, is always weighing the eggs.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So then this, my mush,
Yeah, okay.
just goes in with the dry. And then you can use, and this could work with frozen corn if you want, but you just use 2 cups of corn. So you want a good amount of corn in here. And then
Fresh corn off the cob. What kind of corn are we using here?
Okay, so given that it's November, this is frozen corn, but it is really good.
fresh
It
corn.
was fresh corn at
Okay.
one point, and it's very good with fresh corn.
Okay.
But you could use either. Yeah, and then you just fold it in. So this is very simple. Yeah, I was saying I developed this during the pandemic. It's very funny to develop a recipe while you're at home alone because you're making batches and batches of 12 muffins for yourself. And I started trying to drop them off at friends' houses. I met I thankfully had 2 roommates at the time, but they were by the end of it, they were like, no more corn muffins, please. Please
Fair.
don't bring us corn muffins. All right. And then, you just scoop it out. So I have a greased muffin tin over here. And if you have a cookie scoop, it's really great to just use that. It makes it so easy.
Yep. So greased only, butter, spray.
I
any
just use
option?
spray.
Okay.
And if you don't have a scoop, you can just use a measuring cup. And I just like to grease it just to make it just as easy as a scoop, just about.
And for washing.
Yeah, and for washing, you
Yeah.
just make your life easier. So honestly, then that's it. You just fill them up, and this goes into a 400-degree oven. It's super simple. It takes about 20 minutes. And then we have our beautiful
Ta-da. Just like on TV. And then you have this.
I know, and then the cardamom butter. So, and then the butter is super simple. It's just a stick of butter and a quarter cup of brown sugar, a little bit of cardamom and salt, and it like upgrades muffins so much. And the cardamom and the corn are just so nice together. So, yeah.
I'm seeing the South Indian influence of the cardamom spices.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what she did. So, yeah.
And there are bits of corn popping
Yeah,
out.
yeah. You can like,
I have eggs on my hand.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Cool.
Go ahead, break one. Let's see.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I don't know if you guys can actually. Oh yeah, you can see it on the screen. Yeah. Yeah, they're delicious. So.
Perfection. Thank you so much.
Like I'm gonna say it into.
Let's thank Morgan again. Thanks to both Toni and Morgan for being here tonight. This book definitely, I'm a cookbook fan, but this one I think is the most comprehensive I've seen in a very long time, just having stories and questions and conversation, and then that rigorous scientific testing, but also the origin stories are so amazing. So thank you for lifting the stories of the women in this book.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for being here tonight.